Good morning. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jeff Bruner. I'm with WiLS, and I'm excited to be joined here today by Jeff Arsenault from EBSCO. He's going to be talking to us about their OpenAthens project. I don't want to spend any more time than necessary just to get the ball rolling, because I know Jeff's got a lot of great stuff he's going to be showing us. So Jeff, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, which should empower you to share yours, and then we'll be ready to go.
Wonderful, thanks, Jeff. And yet, a few of us here from EBSCO, your local Wisconsin representatives, Jay and Daniel, who hopefully you are mostly familiar with, and they can handle most of your day-to-day requests for OpenAthens, EBSCO questions, etc. I work with Jay and Dan in authentication here at EBSCO and single sign-on, things of that nature. So today we're here to talk about OpenAthens and how it might be able to best serve the interests of your institutions, your libraries, your librarians, and of course, the end user for which this is really designed to make simple the act of accessing content. So hopefully we'll be able to demonstrate that, and we can go from there. If I just need to pull up the proper screen, if you'll bear with me for one moment. Let's see, there we go. Just need to find PowerPoint in all of the windows that I have open, and we'll be ready to go. Great. So again, what we're here to discuss is OpenAthens itself. OpenAthens is a partner of EBSCO's. It's not our product, but we do sell a great deal of it, and we do support it fully with our own technical colleagues, and we do, as you'll see later on in the demonstration, implement it fully for you. So we can answer just about any question you have around OpenAthens or just general single sign-on questions as the world evolves a little bit, spurred on, I think, a good deal by COVID and the pandemic, and folks having to be outside of their normal patterns and normal geographic locations for accessing content. But SAML itself and remote access through other tools like EZ Proxy and WAM and things like that have been around for the better part of 3 decades. Those of you who might remember, proxy, IP proxy specifically, came about in the early 90s, the advent of the internet and the need for accessing electronic content remotely, and has proliferated greatly as has the web itself. So we'll get into how that affects all of us and how we provide content to our patrons through the course of the discussion here. And there's a chat. If you want to ask questions, you can route it that way. I think everyone has been muted by Jeff so that we can answer all those questions in an orderly fashion. So that's probably the best way to get these answered. And also, just to mention up front that we can provide a more proprietary presentation around the same information for each of your institutions if that is something that you desire after this general session here. So OpenAthens itself is what we would term a single sign-on application. And in this parlance, that generally means that your patrons would be using hopefully a single set of credentials, but hopefully the same set of credentials that they're already familiar with using for what we would term your enterprise or your institution in general, things that are outside the responsibility of the library, right? So we're talking email clients or student information systems or possibly learning management systems, although sometimes those are managed by the library administrators. Those types of tools generally have already a single sign-on application set up to authenticate. Sometimes that's a tool like Shibboleth. It could be Microsoft Active Directory. It could be Okta. There are many tools that provide this. OpenAthens isn't looking to supplant those. Rather, it's looking to work alongside tools like that and hopefully leverage the identity that is already being managed by your colleagues in IT or your information professionals. And we'll get into how all of that happens as well through the course of the discussion. But OpenAthens would be considered a single sign-on application, and also IAM, or Identity and Access Management, which is really yet another acronym in authentication, but it stands for being able to determine who at your institution is able to access which resources. And that could be, depending on your institutional philosophy, everyone has access to everything all the time. That's how we license our content. Or it could be, theoretically, it could be a different user experience and suite of resources for every single patron. Now, that might be a little bit tough to maintain. And so OpenAthens has what are called permission sets, where you would have cohorts of your users. Think maybe we give IEEE to just our engineering students, and we give JSTOR to just our humanities students, or something along those lines. Really, it's an application that's designed to reflect your needs as an institution and how you want to provide that content. There's a lot of flexibility, and it really is determined by, again, your preferences in terms of, and the ability to supply certain information, as we'll get into going forward. But it really gives you a lot of measure of control at the library's access points. So again, predicated on username, password. Hopefully those are usernames and passwords that your patrons are already using and familiar with. We're not looking to really throw any types of changes to that user experience if it's already something that your patrons appreciate, although you certainly can create efficiencies around that. We still have plenty of institutions out there that have 5 different platforms and 5 different sets of credentials, each proprietary, for accessing those. In that case, you could really consolidate all of that into a single set of credentials for your patrons. And we could discuss how that might happen as well going forward here. But really, it's again a tool that's designed for the library. As you'll see, there's an interface that you're able to work in, and it's again intuitive for both administrators and end users, although the way that we provide it through EBSCO, you do have full support. So as an institution, if you wanted to have EBSCO make every single configuration change that you ever require for the life of your OpenAthens subscription, that's fine. If you want to make all of those configuration changes on your own, you're adept at administrating and you like to do this, that's fine too. Most often, it's a collaborative effort where we are sharing some of those responsibilities. You hand off the less savory projects over to us, and we're happy to take those on. But really, once we have everything set up, there's not a great deal of maintenance that has to happen, and we'll show you why as well going forward. OpenAthens itself is predicated on a security protocol called SAML. Some of you have probably heard of that. SAML and IP, Internet Protocol, are the 2 main remote access protocols that are out there. SAML was designed expressly for use on the open web. It is encrypted endpoint to endpoint. It's never been hacked or compromised. It's a good way to share information, even personally identifiable information, if you so choose. Generally, you would do that to enhance the user experience, but it's also important to note that OpenAthens can be as anonymized as IP. That is a common question that we get, especially in the public library sphere, where anonymity is one of the mandates of some of those libraries. It's a general framework that allows you to share as much information as you have and are comfortable sharing. and you know that that is protected. And we'll show you some of the ways that that happens as well as we go forward. And it's cloud-based, so there's nothing for you to have to host or maintain around authentication. It's updated real time, and it's an iterative product. So you're always using the most recent version of the software. You're not having to face upgrades and upgrade paths down the road. For as long as you subscribe, you're always able to access all of the newest features that OpenAthens releases, and you know that you're always using the most recent versions of the software. So thematically, we get a number of different concerns across the different libraries that we talk with around authentication, but they generally tend to be around the same themes, right? Every library is looking for authentication that they have the ability to configure, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be pawned off to third parties, IT or a vendor. It's something that you can control in-house. Although keep in mind, if your bandwidth is full or close to full, we're certainly happy to assist you as much as you need with that. Personalization is increasingly the expectation of our users, especially younger users that are just matriculating. They know and are accustomed to being able to, for example, log into one platform with credentials from another platform on the open web, and they certainly expect that type of experience from their institutes of higher learning. And then for you administrators, being able to administrate, derive analytics, understand how patrons are interacting with content is a key feature of the product, and something that we get asked frequently as well. There is a whole analytics module that we'll spend some time viewing in just a few moments as well. That group access that I touched on before, you may have pre-existing groups. Active Directory, a Microsoft product, has what are called groups in that. We can simply mirror those, or we can create other groups around any type of association that you want. So that could be by groups by job role, or geographic location, or major, or anything else or any reason you might want to gather together end users for the purposes of both resource allocation / limitation, or on the back end, understanding usage. You might, for example, have your budgets allocated by department, so it might be helpful to see how those departments collectively are using certain resources, and we'll show you examples of that as well. Reporting helps with visibility, helps with conveying the value of the library. Always a difficult thing to really quantify when you have to. With data, it certainly helps you show, hey, these are our e-resources, and this is the usage in as granular a manner as down to the individual user if you wanted to quantify that. And we'll show you how you do that. Again, OpenAthens, as part of best practices, recommends anonymizing attributes, but anything that you have and want to quantify as an attribute, you can share and report on with OpenAthens. That could be first name, last name, again, major, department, things of that nature. And then in terms of security overall, OpenAthens, since it does use SAML as a baseline, is a more secure environment, and that generally gets met with enthusiastic approval by our colleagues in information technology, our information professionals who are responsible for the overall domain. OpenAthens, again, using SAML. SAML's never been compromised as a protocol, so it does serve as a great baseline for that. As we mentioned, we're really hoping not to change much for the end user, and if we do, it's designed to be geared towards efficiency. Again, maybe consolidating the number of credentials that a patron has to remember, or just simply making it easier for them to jump from one platform to another in the course of their research. And we'll give you some examples of how that works as well. But there really shouldn't be much for the end user to interact with in terms of authentication, right? It does what most of its work behind the scenes. Patrons are not really considering, gee, I wonder how I'm getting to Science Direct. They just want to know that they can get there obtain that content for whatever project they're working on and do so efficiently. And that's really what all these products are about. And OpenAthens certainly is designed for that. But on the back end for administrators, there becomes a little bit less subtle in changes. You have an interface to work in. It's menu driven, really intuitive. Again, if you want to work in it, you have that. If you want us to perform that for you, we can, but you have the ability to configure resources right within the graphic interface. We'll show you all of this. You have the ability to determine who has access to which resources. You can pull reporting, and you can even use OpenAthens as either if you're not using it for your sole identity provider, meaning loading all that information into OpenAthens, there are some sites that do that. Most, as we mentioned, have some form of enterprise directory that would be more efficient to connect to. But you could also, even if you have a directory, you might have transient members of your community who need to have access to content. Think visiting faculty, lecturers, exchange students, folks that are going to be around for a short period of time. You could use OpenAthens to augment your main identity provider and create accounts in the matter of just a few moments, while even while that person might be standing right in front of you at the circulation desk. So you have flexibility around authentication in terms of being able to configure that. And so all of that functionality, you may have some or all of it already, and of course you want to have it work with the resources that are vital to your patron's success. To that end, OpenAthens does have a managed IP proxy element to it. Not every service provider out there is SAML compliant, although that is changing over time. Single sign-on, certainly, as we mentioned, during the pandemic became something that was, really came into sharp focus because so many people were disrupted from their normal workflows. They were no longer able to be in the physical library or otherwise. They were coming in from a new IP address, their house or wherever that might be. And the nice part about single sign-on, not specifically OpenAthens, but all single sign-on, is that the attribution is at the end user. So it doesn't really matter where you are any longer. It matters who you are and the resource or the institution that you're affiliated with. And we'll discuss that again in a little bit more depth down the road. But ultimately, all of that functionality doesn't hold a lot of sway unless you're able to connect to all the resources that you provide to your patrons. And to that end, with both SAML and IP, OpenAthens provides that. If you're concerned about certain resources and their compatibility, we can always vet a list of resources for you, tell you both, is it going to be compatible either with SAML or IP, and which protocol are we going to use to connect, so that you can plan for certain things like personalization. You can't personalize with IP. It simply doesn't have the granularity as a protocol. So in terms of reporting, the reports module is limited really only by the information that you have and or are willing to share with OpenAthens, and that generally is in the form of those attributes or data points about your patrons. And we'll show you some examples in a real a live instance of the application to really drive that home. But those attributes could be anything about your patrons. Again, first name, last name, phone number, email, major, anything that you have. Important to remember, you have full autonomy over what information ever gets shared with both OpenAthens for the purpose of analytics. And then beyond that, you even have the ability at a different level to share information with service providers on the other end. Some service providers require certain attributes to authenticate. Think about like maybe Overdrive, if some of you have used that. And patrons have to have their own account, or LinkedIn Learning, or things like that nature. But beyond that, really you have control over what information, if any, gets shared with OpenAthens. It can be, as mentioned, as anonymized as IP if you want to configure it that way. It can be highly configured so that you have really granular user groups and usage reporting. So by far the most sought after reporting is resource activity, what content or patrons accessing. And the nice part about OpenAthens is you can see down to an individual patron level, and that could be, again, anonymized. Maybe you have a barcode for each one of your patrons, or it could be first name, last name, username, anything that you want to attribute and have available. You can break those reports down as mentioned by group. That might be really helpful depending on the information that you're trying to obtain. And you can, again, break down by any attribute. You can pivot or facet those reports to see specifically information that you might be targeting for whatever project you're pulling that information for. It's even possible with OpenAthens to share information via an optional programming interface, an API. So if you have a visual analytics tool like Tableau or Power BI or Google Analytics, and you're feeding data from other sources, perhaps your student information system for grades or course attendance or community engagement or any other metrics by which you would measure success of a theoretical patron, you can synthesize that information, send that information programmatically from OpenAthens out to one of those data visualization tools, and really get some fine-grained information and understand outcomes, right? Maybe you can see that, hey, our best performing patrons by grade point average also happen to be the heaviest users of our library's e-resources. That's a really compelling story to be able to tell, to demonstrate that elusive value of the library to the institution as a whole. And I'm sure you can think of some other ways that you could find information to back up some things you know to be true, but are difficult to prove without data, right? So as we mentioned, the most common configuration of OpenAthens is connecting or pointing the tool towards a local directory that's already being managed by your colleagues in IT. That is the reason that is so common, is that it just creates efficiencies for both departments, right? Roles change, people leave the institution, people arrive at the institution every day. It's IT's job to chronicle that in the directory, and if you're leveraging that information, you don't have to maintain it anywhere else, which is efficient for all. But as mentioned, sometimes that's difficult, or you just don't have the information that you want in your institutional identity provider. You can use OpenAthens. You can load information directly into the service and utilize that for whatever that you want to, in terms of, again, those permission sets or reporting or otherwise. So lots of options with that. And certainly if you had questions, what's going to be best for our institution, we can discuss that with you and using your proprietary tools, tell you about compatibility, pluses, minuses, everything like that. At this juncture, with over 2,000 subscribers, I think we've run into just about every type of library and authentication tool, content platform that we might have to connect to. So we generally have direct experience that we can relate to you. Here's why we recommend this. Here's why we think that this might be a better way to go. But ultimately, we're going to execute the setup how you want us to, as long as it's feasible. So in terms of the information that gets sent to OpenAthens, as mentioned, you have control over that. This here is a small screen capture from what we call the schema editor. We'll take a look at what that looks like in the administrative module, but these are attributes, right? So everyone's are going to be different, but there are many similar attributes as mentioned in these user databases: first name, last name, major, department, whatever else you might have. Ultimately, you have full autonomy, as mentioned, over that information and where it gets sent and what it gets used for, which is pretty critical when you're talking about some decently sensitive personal information. We at EBSCO we're compliant, have to be compliant with all of the regulations around that: FERPA, HIPAA, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation of the EU, which is currently the most stringent in the world, everything kind of rolls off of that. But if we are compliant with that, you know that we meet or exceed your local and federal regulations around the protection of personally identifiable information. We do get asked a lot of questions frequently. First being, is this a tool just to connect to content service providers? No, you can use OpenAthens to log into tools like learning management systems, Google, Moodle, Blackboard, Canvas, things like that. You can use Google if that is your identity provider for identity and another way of connecting, but it's not solely just to connect to content platforms. And we get asked this question frequently, less so during COVID, but again, it does have some importance. We use traditional IP on campus. So for our patrons who are here, they don't get asked for authentication. Can we still support that if we have a tool like OpenAthens in place? Short answer to that question is yes. You don't have to maintain different formatted URLs or anything like that. OpenAthens has what's called an IP bypass, similar to what EZ Proxy has, where you can say, we can essentially whitelist your on-campus or on-premise IP addresses and ranges. If OpenAthens sees a request coming from one of those, it will in effect step away from that transaction and let traditional IP handle it. You may find, for a multitude of reasons, that it's better to have patrons authenticate through OpenAthens regardless of where they are. First being that if you're using traditional IP, then you're not using any personalization that you've configured through SAML, and you're not quantifying that usage if you're not going through OpenAthens. And that might be, if your usage is heavy on premise, that might be really valuable information for you to have. In many cases, the user journey does not differ much, if at all, when you're using single sign-on, especially if you have a SAML-based identity provider. But good news is, very easy to turn this on and off so you can test. Is prompting our patrons for credentials thwarting them or creating a less enjoyable user journey or a less efficient user journey? And you can determine that real time. But we definitely recommend using single sign-on for everything, for everywhere patrons might be, for all those reasons. In terms of implementation, we perform that for you. And it's quite simple in terms of what we need. The resources that you subscribe to, because we'll be contacting them on your behalf to configure them for you, exchanging the requisite information, whether that is SAML metadata or simply listing the single static OpenAthens proxy IP address that you would have but be assigned for the IP-based vendors. And then on the other side, like we talked about, a way to connect to your identity provider or directory. And generally, that would be a metadata URL if we're talking about SAML, or parameters. This is where IT would probably be the most involved at the very beginning. The good news for them is that it really doesn't require much from your information colleagues. Once we have this, it's generally self-maintained, and we at EBSCO can perform any kind of support that you need. But it would be parameters, or we even have some custom connections that we have created for OpenAthens to connect to tools for identity, like integrated library systems. We've created connectors for Sierra from III, for Circe, Symphony, for the Library Corporation has a couple of integrated library platforms, and we're working on one for World Share Management Systems from OCLC as well. So again, that whole interoperability element is something that we really believe in at EBSCO, and so does OpenAthens, thankfully. We want this to work with the tools that you have in place or are considering, rather than having these tools force you to make difficult decisions around what you have. We want you to be able to make that choice, what works best for you. In terms of the implementation itself, the first two steps we kind of covered. The questionnaire is just our means of gathering all that information that we need. What are your vendors? What are your tools? What are we going to be connecting? How do we want to craft that user journey? Then we can go out and actually make the vendor contact. We have a team here at EBSCO that does all that for you. Again, exchange that information. And then we would just need to understand the hierarchy of your institution. Do we want to have those permission sets that we talked about? Is it going to be one big overarching permission set where everyone has access to everything all the time? Those kind of questions. Once we understand the hierarchy and we have the vendor contact created, then we can start to test. And by testing, we would use, again, those URLs. OpenAthens has, for those of you that currently use EZ Proxy, a very familiar URL syntax. OpenAthens calls their bit of syntax that would prepend all of your target URLs, your permalinks, the redirector, and it essentially does the same thing. It has a little bit of proprietary information about your institution so that whomever is receiving that request from one of your patrons can say, oh, okay, they're going to log in through OpenAthens. I can look and see, has this patron authenticated already, or do we need to prompt them for that? Maybe this is the very first thing that they're doing. They haven't entered their credentials. And we'll show you how all that works. But again, that's quite simple. That's part of what we would do for setup, is go through all of the tools that you provide your patrons, your access points, we would call that. So that could be a tool like your ILS, right? Your OPAC. It could be a tool like LibGuides, a search tool like EBSCO Discovery Service, Primo, WMS Discovery, etc. It could be just a web page that you have where you list all of your access URLs, or a combination of any or all of those. That's where your patrons would click, and that's where those would be formatted. So we test those links. Are they working for whom they should? Are they working where they should? If we've created any filters, are those functioning as intended? And once we have a high level of confidence that they are functioning as intended, then we can choose a date to go live. And generally, when we're going live, we're talking about making that switch from whatever preceded OpenAthens to OpenAthens itself. And we'll help you with that. There's patron education that we can provide. Why are we making this change? Here's how it benefits the end user. Here's how it benefits the institution, etc., and go from there. And after that, there is generally a short period of user acceptance testing where OpenAthens is being used in a live instance, but we're paying acute attention to your instance and able to jump on any kind of inconsistencies. But by and large, we're going to find all of that during testing. We're not going to recommend to go live until we, again, have a high level of confidence that everything's working as intended. It serves to reiterate that you have full control over the information that gets shared both with OpenAthens and with any other service providers that we configure. And then lastly, a lot of documentation out there for your benefit if you want to do some follow-up research. Again, Jay and Dan are fantastic, responsive, can get you answers to just about anything that you need. But if you'd like to find this information yourself, we'll send these links out to all the WiLS members through Jeff, and these are all live links. You can follow any one of these. We have webinars, both live that you can sign up for, on demand, case studies, so you can see OpenAthens from a peer perspective, not necessarily through an OpenAthens or EBSCO Prism. My favorite resource, the onboarding guide. It's an online tool that really walks you through every consideration that you might make when considering changing authentication. There is a VLE, a virtual learning environment, that is essentially a self-paced, self-guided training module. If you want to become a power administrator, do a lot of this yourself, or again, you can just say, hey, EBSCO, please change this for me. Let me know when you're done. And then there are FAQs. Oftentimes, IT will have some very specific questions around security, around configurations, and those documents can help, and we certainly can have those discussions at any level they need to go to in terms of compliance with regulations, how OpenAthens does what it does, security forms, and anything else like that that might need to be filled out, we can help you with. So that's the overview. I can pause for questions if there are any. I don't see any filtering through the chat. I do plan on showing some of the administrative module in a few moments as well. So if you had questions, what does that look like? What is more of that functionality? We'll definitely get into that for a few moments in just a few moments. All right, so I don't see anything else coming in, and Jay, if you'd be kind enough to just keep an eye on the chat and let me know if there is anything that we need to address, happy to.
Will do. Thanks, Jeff.
Yep, I will pull up in the meantime, I'll pull up the administrative module here. We'll take a quick view, because I do think this being one of the key differentiators between OpenAthens and other authentication tools is something that is best understood when you can kind of see what we're talking about. So give me one moment to pull this up. Great. So this is what we'd call the dashboard. Millersville University in Pennsylvania are kind enough to let us use their live instance, which is fantastic because it's a really robust configuration. We can show you a lot of the potential of the tool. This here, again, would give you some key performance indicators, what resources have been utilized, in this case, in the last 7 days, and then some more granular information over the last month. We have some menus here, some drop downs that really constitute the real meat of the product, if you will. Your account information, this is where you could, for example, create those accounts that I discussed. These might be, again, say you have an exchange student comes up to the circulation desk. Hey, I'm going to be here for 2 weeks. I need to do some research. Okay, great. Create a username for them, create an expiration date so you're not saving yourself another administrative task. It's just going to expire when they're gone. And you could even create a username and password while they're in front of you, even select what content this individual has access to if it's not going to be everything. Or you could add a factor of authentication, have them have to have an email, send them a link to activate the actual account. Really up to you and what's best for your workflows. But that's an example of how you could create that. You can create accounts in bulk. This would just lead to a Microsoft Excel template where you could add attributes here. Say you had a group of 30 high school students that comes in every August for an information literacy course, and they need access to research for the week that they're on campus. You could add them right in OpenAthens rather than having to have IT add them to your permanent directory. The resource catalog, for those of you who currently administrate a tool like EZ Proxy, this might represent the biggest change, I think, in terms of workflow for you. Each one of this is essentially what we would consider a configuration file, all of the possible resources that you want to connect to and how you do that. Each placard represents a different publisher here. OpenAthens connects at the platform level. That's important to understand for both this and for analytics, and I'll show you why. And you can see that these blue placards have been allocated. We've gone through either EBSCO or Millersville have set these service providers up. And in each case here, you see that you have a different name, and you have either SAML-based, if there's nothing to note here, or proxied, right? This would go through the managed proxy. There's no difference to the end user other than the fact that you can't, just by virtue of IP, personalize a proxied platform. Patrons, if they wanted to log into a personal account, would have to do so once they got into ABC Clio, to use the example that's right here. However, when using SAML for something like AAAS, you could, EBSCO host as well, you could log your patron right into these platforms, right into their personalized version. So my folder, my EBSCO host folder, and that does have some benefits beyond just a nice user experience. One fewer authentication prompts. Content like ebooks is where this really comes in handy, since ebooks have individual licenses. They have digital rights management. You're probably aware, they prompt patrons to log in for certain functionality, like downloading a title. And often that's confusing. Hey, I just logged in. Wait a minute, these credentials are different. You know what? This is a hassle. I'm just going to go out somewhere else when that content's sitting right there for them, and it might be ideal. We don't want to throw any hurdles. And we know through research, right? It could be a first-year student, or it could be a postdoc doing research. Anytime you throw anything at them that's outside of an efficient user experience, you're giving them a chance to say, you know what, I'm just going to do something else, which we spend way too much time, effort, and frankly money curating all of these resources. We don't want them to be thwarted by something like an authentication prompt. So that's where single sign-on, I think, really comes in handy for content like that, in addition to being more secure and permitting a more friendly user journey. But we'd go through, this is where we would take that list, contact each one of these service providers, exchange the requisite information, and set them up. And say you added a new, you can see here, they don't have anything that they're authenticating currently through AAAS. Maybe you got a new subscription to Science, and hey, EBSCO, please configure AAAS for us for OpenAthens and send us a link when you're finished, or you could simply do it yourself. That's the intent of this interface right here, but that's how you would go about doing it. And I mentioned the how does that happen, and this is that little snippet of syntax that would go in front of your target URLs, right? HTTPS : ebscohost.com or sage.com or whatever it might be. You can generate a link right there, and then that would be what you would throw into Moodle or your 856 field of your MARC records, or your link resolver or whatever else. Or again, we could do that for you, of course, which we probably will when we're setting everything up. And then in terms of reporting, let's see if I can pull up. My tabs are hidden, so give me one moment here. Go back. Pull up the reporting module, because I do think that that is really one of the key differentiators between OpenAthens and other forms of authentication that are out there. And this is the reporting dashboard. This will give you a good idea of what resources are the most commonly accessed over what period of time, the total number of authentications, or essentially the traffic across your access points or research websites. The total number of accounts should be a fairly known and static number, and then where that usage is occurring in the world. Now, Millersville's in the States, so that's where most of the usage is happening. But as you can see, even in this current context of the pandemic, they have patrons across the world, right? Exchange students, maybe instructors that are on sabbatical or traveling or otherwise. And you can get a lot more granular. And this is really where, when we mention the limitations being what you have or are willing to supply, come into play. Each one of these is an attribute. As you can see, some of them definitely contain personally identifiable information. It's up to you if you want to share that. Some don't. Millersville assigns each one of their patrons what they call an M number. That's a pseudonymous attribute. Doesn't mean we can't tell who M00065200 is, but they can. That's the idea. But what we can tell is, hey, this is our power user across all resources of our library, and maybe these, as mentioned, these top 10 users also happen to be in the top 10 or whatever percentile of students by grade point average, and that's a compelling story to be able to tell with data. Or maybe we want to see usage on a single platform broken down by, as mentioned, department, because this is how we allocate our budget. Maybe the history department and the music department are splitting this resource cost-wise right down the middle. But as you can see, over whatever time period we want to pull from, in this case, history students are using this twice as much. Maybe an even split of the cost isn't the most representative, and maybe with the cost share savings, the music department could go out and get another different resource that's more relevant. But those are the type of real world examples that you could start to populate and understand if you have, again, the attributes available or can create them, right? This is also downloadable. You can save this to a flat CSV file so that you can export it to different tools. And as mentioned, there is an optional available API if you want to send this data programmatically out to another tool to do that for you. You can view these in bar graph format, line graph format, whatever's more effective in telling the story that you're telling with this data. And you can schedule these reports to recur at whatever frequency makes sense for your institution, daily, weekly, monthly. You can send them to fellow administrators. You can send them to anyone, really. Maybe you had an instructor who requested certain content, wants to be sure that their students are using said content. You can send them a report every Friday to make sure that so that they can follow up and make sure that's happening. Lots of different ways I'm sure you can envision using this information. And then you can save reports so you don't have to build them ad hoc all the time when you want to run certain reports. So that's the Data Explorer, the resource usage module. And then I mentioned we'd show you how do we configure those attributes? How do we tell OpenAthens, hey, I want you to quantify the username, right? Make it reportable or stop it from being reportable. I want to be able to release this attribute to ProQuest because they need it for whatever reason, right? Part of what we do when we set up is we would map all of these that you have available. You might call this, for example, user underscore ID in your identity provider, whatever that might be. We'll map that so that this is username and that you are able to quantify it if you want. These are all just standard shibboleth attributes here. You might have very different ones. We call them custom attributes. It's really no limitation as long as you can supply it in a format that OpenAthens can consume, then you can make those reportable or releasable, or these also populate those permission sets that I talked about before, those permission sets being those cohorts of users that you might want to allocate specific resources to, or just use for the purposes of analytics. I want to know how these different groups of patrons are using content. As you can see, each group can have a different number of patrons and a different number of resources based on the applicability for this. We have institutions that this is fairly robust, probably a dozen or so. We have institutions that have hundreds of permission sets, one for every single program that degree granting program that they offer. It's really up to you. And we have plenty of institutions that have one of these. Everyone, that's as granular as we get. Everyone has access to everything. Attribute release, like we talked about. Again, this is only for SAML service providers. We can't send attributes via IP, but for those that we can, OpenAthens never shares anything personally identifiable as a default, right? This policy here, targeted ID and persistent ID. You can see this is an alphanumeric string of characters, going to be unique for each one of your patrons. That's how service providers can differentiate. You can personalize platforms without sending any personally identifiable information. Everyone's going to have one of these and it's going to be different. You have entitlement and role. Who is this individual? What have you provided them with access to via your institution? Or an org ID, just to denote, hey, we have an active subscription to the content that this individual is requesting. Beyond that, as you can see, each one of these placards represents a different service provider. You can send a lot more information. Some of this definitely is personally identifiable for whatever reason. Generally, for personalization, making the user journey a little friendlier. But in this case, right, they send to Alma, their library services platform, just that M number that we looked about, that pseudonymous, anonymized attribute, that still allows Alma to differentiate every single patron and therefore enable patron empowerment. So, hey, I can see my holds, my fines, things like that in the library services platform. You can also, this is really cool, what Millersville did with their interlibrary loan application is they worked with Atlas Systems, who hosts it for them, not OCLC, to use SAML to populate the dozen or so fields that they require for their interlibrary loan. And what they realized was there was anemic usage of it before, probably owing to the fact that patrons didn't want to fill out 12 fields. They just go on to something different. When they implemented this, those fields automatically got filled out, and all the patron had to do is say yes or no. Do you want this content shipped to our library? And usage spiked measurably. So they knew right away that was the deterrent, and they used SAML to make it the user experience easier, make the library more valuable to the end user. Pretty cool single use case for that. But there are lots of different ways that SAML can just make it, easier. It doesn't have to be streamlining 12 fields. It could just be, hey, Jane Smith, here's your article from Science Direct, and here's your account. Here's the things that you were looking at yesterday when you had to leave your research because something popped up, something urgent. So cool features like that, and it's configurable by your institution. These are all editable. You can remove these policies. You can have everything roll up to this global policy, or you can make it proprietary for a single service provider. And then lastly, how do we connect to identity? We've talked about that a bunch. As you can see here, they have a number of different identity providers. If you wanted to add one, this is generally how we would do it. Say you have Active Directory from Microsoft, and we're going to use ADFS, which is Federated Services. That's basically SAML. We would go to IT. Hey, what's your SAML metadata file? They would have that right here, or they might have, or URL, excuse me, or they might have it in an XML file format. We prefer the URL because it's dynamic, whereas this is static. You might have to update it if things change. And once this is entered, we have effective and bound, right? It has to have an active security certificate and certain elements to it. But once that's bound, then any of your patrons who are in good standing could create an account and using their same credentials and go out and access content if it's formatted. That's part of all of what we do during setup. But as you can see here, there's no limit to the number of identity providers. Millersville has some reciprocity with some of their dually enrolled grad students with Kutztown, Shippensburg, Westchester. So what they do is when a patron arrives at an access point, hasn't authenticated yet, they say, okay, which directory do you want us to query with your credentials? They might be a full-time Millersville student taking some classes at Kutztown. They want to log in through Kutztown for this because they have a slightly different collection that might have something that they're seeking for the class that they take at this institution. Most places are going to have one directory here, maybe two. You might have a different directory for alumni or faculty versus students or something along those lines. But again, it's owing to the flexibility of OpenAthens. You could connect multiples here, and there's a corresponding screen that would show you, hey, which institution do you want to log in through? Or you could map this right to your institution's Active Directory login screen that patrons are used to seeing, or wherever else you might direct your patrons to log in. Again, the guiding principle is to make this least disruptive to your end users, unless we're creating efficiencies for them, right? Refining or iterating that experience. So again, we're going to try to fit this into your current user journey as best as possible, especially if it's one that you really like and have worked hard to create. We don't want to change anything there if we don't have to. So that's a general brief tour of the administrative module, things that you can do in there. I will open it back up to questions. I don't see anything coming through the chat yet. And I will also reiterate that we are happy to perform a demonstration like this for maybe some of your other colleagues, technical colleagues, answer questions as you have them, any format that works, online, email, whatever works best for you. Looks like we have a few moments left in the hour. I'll turn it back over to the attendees, and Jay, Dan, Jeff, if you have any kind of closing comments that you want to, please feel free.
Thanks, Jeff. This is Jay Hess. I just wanted to mention that, as you mentioned earlier, Jeff, most customers know both Dan and I, but I did put our emails in the chat box in case people are interested in taking a closer look and or would like pricing information.
Yes, yep, that's Jay and Dan are your go-tos for any of that type of information, implementation, timeframes, pricing, and they could certainly coordinate a follow-up presentation if anyone is interested in that. And I don't see any more questions. Jay is thanking everybody for your attendance. I also echo that sentiment. And Jeff, thank you so much for hosting and having us on for the afternoon here. We sincerely appreciate it.
It's our pleasure, Jeff. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to meet and interact with another Jeff. I don't know if that's been your experience. I don't know that many other Jeffs, so it's always nice to meet one. So thank you again for another excellent demonstration. It's a great tool. I hope some of our members find that they want to learn more.
Wonderful. Well, thanks all. We sincerely appreciate it, and hopefully we can speak more in the weeks coming.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend, and yeah, reach out to us if we can do anything for you. Bye, everyone.
Bye all.